been over the last 5 years that we have seen patient after patient after patient who actually has devastation in their lives or devastation in their families, and who has done very well. And it's just hearing those stories again and again which has been so exciting. We had one guy who said that he has allowed himself to think about the future and to talk about the future with his grandchildren once again. He had actually stopped because he wouldn't talk to them about the future because he knew that he would not be part of it. And now he's allowed himself to do that. We had another woman who said that her husband is an excellent guitarist, and he had lost that ability, and that he now got the nuance in his guitar playing back again. Another woman who actually had lost her ability to play the piano, and that came back. A woman who had lost her ability to speak a foreign language, which she had been very good at when she was young. She actually learned to speak both Chinese and Russian, and these started to come back as she improved. So the stories are just heartwarming and very exciting to hear. And of course, from the other parts of the family member, one girl said that her mother had become part of the family once again. So these are really exciting to hear. It means that the science that we've all been working on for so many years really can change the world. It really means that the things that we're looking at in the test tubes and the various DNA base pairs that we've talked about, and the molecular genetics that we've all studied for years, the whole molecular biology revolution is leading us to real answers that impact human lives all over the world. That's very exciting.
Well, originally I was diagnosed with some major damage to the white matter in my brain, and I can go into the details about that in just a bit. I also had a serious cardiac condition. My whole body hurt. I was obese, I was forgetful, and I was emotionally out of control.
Wow. And so tell me more about this condition with your brain. How serious was that?
That was serious enough that I couldn't remember a telephone number from looking at it on a piece of paper to being able to dial it on the phone. Today I'm able to, and if this were not being recorded, I could recite to you the 16 digits on my debit card. And I never set out to memorize those. I now not only have my vocabulary back, but I can memorize numbers, and I know where I'm going, and I know when I get into a room what I'm there for. I didn't know that before. I was lost in my own home. I was lost in my own brain.
Wow, how long did you experience that for?
It was getting progressively worse over probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 years. I've been a professional healthcare provider for all of my adult life, and I saw what happened to people that lost their brains, or that lost the ability to use what was in their brains. And that was exactly what was happening to me. It was like I was standing outside a library. The door was locked. I knew where that book was inside, but I couldn't get to it. I knew the information was in that book, but I couldn't approach it. The door was locked. I couldn't get to it.
How did that feel for you?
I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. Where was this leading me? This is very emotional for me.
And it sounds like you weren't ready to go.
Oh no. Oh no, I've got lots of living to do yet. Lots of living.
It was quite quickly after she got out of the hospital. It wasn't, she knew what was going on. It wasn't like it wasn't from like an outside looking in. She realized that she was having some memory problems as well, and we would have conversations, and then about 3 hours later she'd forget what I had talked to her about, which can be heartbreaking, frustrating, upsetting, all those kinds of things when you see a family member that's kind of suffering a little bit. But yeah, it was really just the dementia. It was really just the memory. She couldn't remember just the little things. It wasn't like she'd completely forget hours and hours of time, but it was enough to really affect her lifestyle and the family dynamic for sure.
And did you see future images of her declining and being like losing cognition?
I mean, at that point, I wasn't looking. I didn't really have a medical education at that point. I was still in my undergraduate, doing my undergraduate at the University of Manitoba. So I wasn't really looking long term. I was kind of that selfish 18-year-old that was kind of being like, "Mom, you're not listening to me. What's going on with you?" So it was scary, but I wasn't really looking long term. Now, knowing what I know about dementia, it would have been terrifying. So sometimes ignorance can be bliss, I think.
Tell me how your mother turned her situation around.
Well, she saw her naturopathic doctor. They ran a whole bunch of tests, and they found that she had a vitamin B12 deficiency, which is super easy to fix, thank God. So within 2 weeks, she was back to normal. She was doing vitamin B12 shots twice a week intramuscularly, and within that she still does them, but within that 2 weeks, she was back to just the amazing person that she is. So that was fantastic. It was like magic. It was really cool, actually, to see. Yeah.
That's bringing up emotion for you. What is
it?
It
is, yeah,
it
is. I don't know. It's just, sorry. Knowing what I know now about dementia and how it affects the person as well as the family, it's scary. So I'm glad that there was a simple solution to such a complicated problem.
Yeah.
Selfish relief, just seeing where she was and how easy it was for her to bounce back. It's that relief, because knowing what I know now, and seeing and having seen people go through what dementia actually does to a person, really, it's really scary and it's really heartbreaking. So I'm just glad that I got my mom back.
I had damage to my white matter, forgetfulness.
That's the
Absolutely
same as
forgetfulness.
both of those. What else?
Pretty much that was it. I was losing my vocabulary. I knew that I knew that word, but I couldn't think of it. I knew that I knew that person's name, but I couldn't think of it.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I knew that phone number from here to here, and I couldn't put those two together.
But
I know that my neurologist told me that there was no way to repair it. And I said to her, well, I'm going to do what I can. Now that I know what the problem is, I'm going to do what I can. I know that when a road or a bridge is washed out, there's a detour. Maybe I can find another way into that library.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. I did. I was able to reroute and get into that place where that memory was stored. I remember numbers now. I remember people's names. I remember their faces.
Great.
I remember conversations most of the time. I remember where I put things and why I'm in a room. I remember when I go to the mailbox, that letter that I'm holding, am I there to mail it or am I just collecting it? I know that I'm there to mail it.
Now, each day, do you feel that your memory is getting a little bit better or a little bit worse?
Oh, it's absolutely improving. Much better.
Great.
I remember birthdays. I remember not only first names, I remember last names, middle names. I remember how much my grandchildren weighed when they were born. I remember their little tiny faces.
Grandchildren are the most precious thing, and they are the crown
Yes.
of grandparents. The crown, right? Could you think of a better way to describe what a grandchild is to a grandparent?
It's the rose on the thorny bush.
Yeah.
It's the tomato on that plant. It's the sunshine. Not just the sun is there, but it's the sunshine on your skin. It's the joy. And it's not all the other stuff that goes along with being the parent. We get the fun part. As grandparents, we get the fun part.
Alzheimer's is a degenerative condition of the brain which affects a person's ability to remember. They lose their memory. They lose their short-term memory, and then with time they lose all memory altogether. And Alzheimer's is a deadly condition. It can be fatal. As the brain degenerates, so does control of bodily functions, and when it gets to a certain point, it can be fatal. Talk about the brain. Let's talk about what affects the brain by way of degeneration. What causes the brain to start to fall apart like this? Let's see what different contributing factors that we know exist here. So number one is nutritional deficiency. Okay, in Alzheimer's you have brains that are devoid of very key nutrients like essential fatty acids, B vitamins, certain minerals. There are, in conjunction with the nutritional deficiencies, there's also increased amounts of heavy metals that are deposited in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. And these heavy metal deposits seem to be the major contributing factor to the amyloid protein deposits that happen in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. My favorite analogy of what heavy metals do to tissues is heavy metals do to your cells what a splinter does to the bottom of your foot. Okay? Consider a splinter stuck into your foot, okay? It hurts, causes inflammation, it causes infection, causes irritation, and the area swells up and it gets all irritated, infected, inflamed, all at one time, right? So let me give you an analogy here. Heavy metals affect your cells the same way a sliver would affect the bottom of your foot. Okay, if you have a sliver in the bottom of your foot, it causes irritation and inflammation, and then infection. Infection sets in, right? And you have this cycle as the infection clears up, your immune system clears that up, reduces the inflammation, the irritation is still there, so with time it becomes inflamed again, then it gets infected again, and then, that whole cycle just keeps going and going and going as long as the sliver's there. Well, until you pull the sliver out, you're going to have irritation, you're going to have inflammation, you're going to have infection. It's going to be a cycle. You're going to just continually get these three I's, as I call them. In your cells, similar thing happens if they're toxic with heavy metals. Heavy metals act as that irritant and keep causing the cells to become inflamed, and as they become inflamed, they become more easy to infect, and when they become infected, they die off. Okay? And this same process happens in all of our cells. All of our cells, whether they're neurons in our brain or, tissue in our finger, that process will go on if they are toxic. Okay? There's two particular heavy metal toxin compounds that massively affect our brains and nervous system. One is the combination of fluoride and mercury. Okay. The other one is the combination of fluoride and aluminum. And these compounds, when they come into contact with each other and create a compound in our body, and they float up into our brain, they cause neuron death. Okay, they kill brain cells, and as they kill those brain cells, proteins are deposited in those areas, and we have what are called the amyloid protein deposits. And those amyloid protein deposits don't contain memories, and they don't allow us to access memories either. And so they cause memory dysfunction, and we call that Alzheimer's disease. Okay, that's one of the methods, one of the processes that can cause Alzheimer's. There is a autoimmune, quote unquote, component to Alzheimer's, where there's such inflammation in the brain that as the immune system is trying to clean up the inflammation, it actually does cause damage to the brain. And then when we have this process, or have this condition where we have nutritional deficiencies and these toxicities, particularly heavy metal toxicities, it affects the brain deeper and deeper and deeper. And the longer that goes on, the more damage that occurs in the brain. And we end up with memory issues.
When I'm looking at the brain, not only considering the gut, but also like what's actually inflaming the brain outside of that. You want to look at toxins. A couple toxins that specifically affect the brain: aluminum, which is a modern day epidemic right now. Even the bioengineering of dropping the stratospheric bioengineering, chemtrails people call it, but aluminum in there to try to reflect some of the sun, so we're not having damaging effects from the sun. Like, aluminum exposure is everywhere. So aluminum loves the brain. Mercury loves the brain as well too. So if you have dental amalgam fillings with mercury inside, we know there's going to be a certain amount of mercury in the brain for every amalgam that you have and for a certain time period.
Well, Alzheimer's is a pretty tough one, right? Once it's set in, it is pretty tough to get it under control. So the main thing is prevention. Just like every other manifestation of overconsumption of sugar, right, is to really get diligent about it. Okay, now how do you do that, right? Managing our sugar intake is an emotional commitment. Everywhere we go, we are surrounded by sugar. You're driving down the road, every convenience store is full of sugar. It is just ever present in our environment, right? So people are using sugar for emotional comfort, for celebrations, for how to escape from sadness and depression. And so really, I believe the first step of managing our sugar addiction is to increase our emotional IQ, to really work with a spiritual practice, work with a therapist if that's helpful to you, work with stress management, start to find other ways to comfort ourselves besides sugary substances. And that gives us a clearer choice over eating foods that are really nourishing. It's all about the prevention when it comes to sugar.
And do you think that leads to a happier life?
It's an interesting question, right? I think it leads to a life with less disease, which in the long run definitely leads to a happier life. When somebody has cancer or advanced diabetes or Alzheimer's, the question of being happy is really not the main issue anymore, right? Now it becomes a matter of, am I going to live or die? Right, so this is the tricky thing about sugar. Most people love eating sugar. It makes them feel happy, right? Why is that? It's because it releases endorphins, right? These are biochemical brain chemistry that gives us the perception of happiness. So the more we can find other sources of joy that are not linked to sugar, dancing, learning to play music, all of the types of entertainment that our grandparents enjoyed that are non-electronic, that are not going to add stress to our lives, playing cards, playing dominoes, exercising, playing sports. All of these ways that we can find joy and raise our endorphins and create a sense of well-being without having to use sugar to create that is, I believe, the entry point to living a new life with a different sense of happiness, let's say.
And then, like, eating fruit is good or bad?
Wow, fruit is an interesting one, right? So most people can do well and benefit from eating a couple of servings of fruit a day, right? Some people will be reactive to even that level of fructose, right? The main type of sugar in fruit being fructose, and that's processed directly by the liver. It puts a burden on the liver, and so if someone's liver is already stressed out, just the smallest amount of fruit might create an inflammatory response in the body. So I believe a lot of people overconsume fruit in their attempt to lose weight because we're all told to eat our fruits and vegetables, right? And Of course, that's better than high fructose corn syrup or all the packaged processed foods in the center part of the grocery store. But really, the key is vegetables, right? Small amount of fruit, lots of vegetables, right? And healthy fats and appropriate amount of protein. It's the basics. It's really not that hard.
Let's talk real quick about sugar. Okay, sugar. It's interesting. The average person in the United States consumes almost 100 pounds of sugar a year. That's astronomical. That's massive amounts of calories in the form of sugar. Well, sugar is an essential nutrient. It's something our body does need. It doesn't need it in massive quantities, but it does need some of it. When we flood our system with sugar, okay, it's very similar to flooding a car with fuel. Okay, our system will spit and sputter like a car that's flooded, quote unquote, with fuel will spit and sputter. Okay, so things don't operate as well. Okay, another thing that happens with excessive sugar intake is that our red blood cells start to crystallize. Okay, not only do they not carry oxygen and nutrients very well then, but they crystallize with sugar crystals, and they have kind of like barbs on them, or I say similar to prickers on a rose stem. Okay, that are protruding from the red blood cell. Okay, and as those crystallized red blood cells float around through the system, they tear up the blood vessels. They cut and damage our blood vessels. Okay, very damaging. And this is why folks with diabetes have such poor circulation. Okay, as their blood vessels have been tore up by these crystallized red blood cells, and they've got scarring in their blood vessels, and so the blood vessels don't expand and contract very well. Therefore, circulation gets reduced. Well, with the projections right now, we're filming in 2017. The projections are that by 2030, 50% of the U.S. population will have type 2 diabetes. Now, that being the case, type 2 diabetes is when the system has been flooded with sugar for so long. The cells no longer will accept sugar very well, and they do that by way of shutting down the insulin receptor sites. Okay, so you got this keyhole where insulin fits into. Okay, and what happens is when the cells have been so saturated with sugar, they close down the keyhole, and so the key doesn't fit into it anymore. Okay, and you get what we call insulin resistance. So insulin resistance, if that happens in your brain, protein starts getting deposited in the brain, these amyloid proteins that disrupt our recall ability and disrupt our memory, and you end up with a condition very similar to Alzheimer's. There is, they even call, some people call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes instead of type 2 or type 1, they call it type 3 diabetes. And it's insulin resistance of the brain. Okay, and that's because the brain cells have been just chock full of sugar for so long. They don't want any more. Okay, and they lock the door by shutting down the keyhole, so the key can't fit in the hole anymore. The key being insulin. Okay, and so we become insulin resistant, and that's a very bad thing because the only food source, the only fuel source for our brain is sugar. Okay, so if we don't have enough sugar getting into the brain doesn't work well. Well, if it doesn't work well, think of all the different things, that only affects everything that the brain affects. So if you think of, what doesn't your brain affect? Your brain's your body's control center. And so it affects everything. Okay. So with Alzheimer's, there are the path for correcting Alzheimer's has to include a whole food organic diet. Okay, we have to get away from chemicals and pesticides and herbicides and things that are going to be pro-inflammatory. Okay, and let me just step over 1 minute. We'll come back to that thought here. Inflammation in our body will lead to insulin resistance. Okay, because inflammation in our cells will cause damage of the insulin receptor sites. So that keyhole for the insulin key to fit into, if we have too much inflammation in the cell, it can damage that keyhole. So instead of the keyhole being arranged like this, if the cell becomes oxidized because of too much sugar or because of too much inflammation, the keyhole can get tipped or turned or damaged in a way that the key doesn't fit into it anymore. Okay, so if it's supposed to be like this and the key fits in like this, if the keyhole gets tilted, the key can't fit into there. Okay, if it gets tilted this way, it can't fit in. If it gets tilted like this, the key just doesn't fit in. If the keyhole gets warped, the key doesn't fit in. Okay, all those things happen in the presence of inflammation. Okay, inflammation causes oxidation of those insulin receptor sites, and this is everywhere in the body that happens. So in the course of for correcting Alzheimer's, okay, if we were to remediate Alzheimer's, we have to regulate fuel. Okay, and that would be your food. We have to regulate the amount of fuel coming in. What I do with Alzheimer's patients as far as diet goes is I have them eat when they eat 2 parts vegetables. Okay, and these are greens, yellows, oranges, green vegetables, red vegetables, yellow vegetables, purple vegetables. Okay, on their plate, 1/2 of their plate has to be vegetables. 1/2, or the other half, is half protein and half fruit. So they have 2 parts vegetable at every meal, 1 part protein at every meal, and 1 part fruit at every meal. And this stabilizes their blood sugar. Okay, it brings it down to where it should be. It also maximizes the amount of nutrients, especially the brain protecting nutrients that they're getting from their food.
Should we get genetic testing to assess Alzheimer's risk?
Yeah. So my opinion is that we should all get genetic testing to assess our Alzheimer's risk, and also biochemical testing. So what we recommend is that everyone 45 years of age or over should have, just like you would get a colonoscopy when you're 50, you should get a cognoscopy when you're 45 or older. And so that would look at your biochemistry and genetics. It would look at your function with things like Brain HQ or online assessments of cognitive function. And it would, if you're symptomatic, look at your imaging studies. And so, of course, this would include your genetics, and there are many SNPs associated with Alzheimer's disease. Of course, the most important genetic association as a risk factor is ApoE, the epsilon 4 allele. If you have 0 copies, you have about a 9% chance during your lifetime of developing Alzheimer's. Single copy, about 30%. And if you're homozygous, 2 copies, then you have somewhere between a 50 and 90% chance of developing it. But in the past, people recommended not to check this because you couldn't do anything about it. We disagree with that now. There's a lot you can do about it, and there are a lot of studies coming out showing that there is effective prevention, such as the finger study that came out of Finland. And so in our own work shows that you can not only prevent but also reverse, especially early on, cognitive decline. So therefore we recommend that everybody be tested.
We haven't been able to fathom the depths of the brain. We don't even use 1%. Because of the synapses, there's 100 billion BET cells, and there's 10,000 synapses, and that means that the possibility is between 60 and 220 trillion possibilities. And we can't even think of that number, how big it is. I have to tell you this. If you've been alive for 1 million seconds, that's less than 2 weeks. It's just between 1 and 2 weeks. If you take 1 billion seconds, that's 32 years, but 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. So that puts it into perspective. And that's a wonderful thing to realize, that we have all those possibilities, and now we know for sure, they did it in animal models, but now we know for sure that every day a person is making around 7,000 new brain cells. And they're going into the area of the hippocampus where there's memory, and they're going into the area of the amygdala where our emotions are and everything like that. And if you don't use them, and if you don't inculcate it, I mean, you're going to be able to do fantastic things. I had a patient that couldn't talk for 7 years. Her kids didn't even know that she was able to talk, but she was determined, and she was able to start talking. She would be a little bit slow on some of the words because she hadn't run into those in the past, and so she would, she could explain what it is but she couldn't tell you what the word was. I mean, this is just wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's great. And so that does give a lot of hope for things like Alzheimer's and dementia. I mean,
oh yeah, that's the lecture I give. Alzheimer's is preventable, completely preventable, and a lot of it, the early Alzheimer's is reversible, because you dilate all those little tiny blood vessels up, and then those parts of the brain start functioning. When people come here, everybody gets a little bit of help from it, and some people get, it depends on where in the brain it is, but some people get dramatic results in that.
wow. And I think that the key with the blue zone of all these Seventh-day Adventist people that you've connected with and worked with, and you see people that have reached 100 years old, and you see they're doing it, they're not like, I'm seeing them in interviews that I'm doing, and they're able to account things properly.
Well, one of the things is they have the Loma Linda Lopers, and they get all these people dressed in a pink, bright pink shirt, and like on Sunday you see all these people going by, and so there's their exercise. So that's why they chose Loma Linda,
Oh yeah. But look at these guys and look at what they did. They had enormous community, right? So they're engaging their mind, their happy hormones, their laughter, their smiles. They were rigorous with having rest. They were rigorous, so they would mark a day, once a week where they would not be working. They did that most of them all their lives. They were a part of these case study groups. They were adamant with nutrition. They were temperate. They wouldn't just overdo things. And then so they had these 8 different pillars that they were using for their health. What do you see as some really effective solutions as a clinician? What do you see as what people can do today to effectively prevent Alzheimer's and dementia, or to use these same strategies potentially to then turn back the clock as well if somebody's seeing the early onset or even the later onset of some of these things?
Yeah, I love healthy fats. Our brain is made of mostly cholesterol, which again then goes to our culture right now. What's happening, Jonathan, is your cholesterol's too high. Like we're just gonna pick the range we want and keep lowering that so that everybody eventually will be into the cholesterol lowering medication category, and we're gonna lower your cholesterol. And the brain is mostly cholesterol. So when we lower that, we're literally like, taking cholesterol away from our body that could be used for health of our brain. So I see kind of a correlation between the statin drugs or the cholesterol lowering medication. The more that goes up, then the more brain issues it seems like we're having right now. So I think we want to take almost the opposite effect of healthier fats. And there's been some great research on medium chain triglycerides, or otherwise known as MCT or MCT oil. There's MCT powders now that are out there and things, but essentially it's a ketone body, or MCT is processed in the liver, only takes a few steps versus regular fats that take multiple steps, to kind of get energy from it. But the ketone is very clean burning. It's basically, ketone, I like to think of it as natural gas burning versus regular sugar burner, which most Americans, unfortunately are sugar burner. But when you're a sugar burner, think of it like old school fireplace, the smoky fireplace, right? The black smoke, like the more dirty smoke coming off versus the natural gas where there's like nothing given off, there's no unhealthy byproduct or something like that. So ketone bodies are basically fuel for the brain. And if we're stuck in, not consuming a lot of healthy fats, not giving nutrition for the body, and we're stuck with a lot of sugar-ridden things, high sugar foods, artificial processed ingredients, things that actually spike blood sugar, toxins actually spike blood sugar. But if we're consuming higher sugar foods, or we're exposed to toxins that spike our blood sugar, affect the insulin, then now all of a sudden that's burning dirtier, and then it causes more damage to our brain. So I believe diet is a big piece to it, like what we're eating and how, and I don't think there's one diet for everybody, right? I always take a step back and I'm like, what fat are we in now? Ketogenic, paleo, vegan, raw, like there's all kinds of, there's a big spectrum. And I like to think in the diet category that there's a season for it, and then also looking at your own blueprint. But diet's huge. Engagement, you had mentioned, with the relationship side, right? That when we actually have a relationship with the community around us, and we're not huckered in and kind of hermit-ish, and my wife would laugh because I'm like the hermit of the family. She's like, hey, do you want to go out? And she's like, I already know your answer, no, but come on, let's go, let's go over to Jonathan's house and see Jonathan and Lori, And I'm like, yes, because I feel so much better, right, being around people. But in the chronic illness category, when you're having unexplained illness, autoimmunity, it's really easy just to, nobody understands, they don't get what I'm going through. And then all of a sudden you stay in your house, you don't leave, you don't have that community. So when we're looking at keeping the brain healthy, relationships are huge, not just with family, but like community. Looking at your why, challenging your brain. The people that do like the word puzzles or Sudoku versus just the people that sit on the couch and watch TV. I mean, you can already see the path that those two are on are different, right? Somebody that's engaging their brain and working that quote unquote muscle versus somebody that's just kind of like, I'm checked out and, I'm not using my brain.
Diet and lifestyle are extremely important. So DESS, diet, exercise, sleep, and stress. Diet, very important, and there are several different approaches people have taken. Of course, the Mediterranean diet has gotten a lot of press and has had a very positive impact in terms of cognition. Others prefer, other approaches, paleo diets or ketogenic diets. We use something that we call KetoFlex 12-3, which recognizes that you want to drive someone into a mild ketosis. That it is a flexitarian, so if you want to have small amounts of meat and fish, that's fine. You can be a vegetarian or not, as you wish, but if you're going to use them, of course, you want, pastured chicken, you want the, grass-fed beef, you want low mercury, so-called smash fish. You don't want to have high mercury fish, and of course you want wild-caught fish. So all these usual things, you don't want to exceed somewhere, around 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein. You don't want to have too much protein. So you want a largely plant-based, mildly ketogenic with fasting 12 hours and 3 hours. And for the ApoE4 positive individuals, they often like to take it to 14 to 16 hours for the fasting at night to develop a situation biochemically in which you have optimum cognition and inhibition of continued decline. And then, of course, other lifestyle things. There are many. Exercise, absolutely critical. It is helping to drive you into a mild ketosis. It turns out that beta-hydroxybutyrate, among other things, increases the transcription of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There are other effects as well. And then, of course, many other salutary effects of exercise. Sleep. Sleep, of course, is just one thing after the other coming out about how critical it is. It is a time for brain cleansing. Getting enough sleep at night is absolutely critical for your cognition. And then, of course, stress. And coming back to sleep for a moment, about 75% of people who have sleep apnea are not diagnosed with sleep apnea. It's a critical contributor to cognitive decline. And stress. If you want to kill off some hippocampal neurons, run up your cortisol, you'll kill off some hippocampal neurons. So all these things are absolutely crucial, and I think that they've been under-recognized over the years for their important contributions that they make to what we ultimately call Alzheimer's disease.
Our next question was, does sleep deprivation affect Alzheimer's? Yes, it does. It can affect the development of Alzheimer's, and it can affect whether or not someone recovers from Alzheimer's. The major factor in that is the lack of melatonin. Okay, the hormone produced by our pineal gland called melatonin is extremely neuroprotective. Okay, it's one of the antioxidants our body produces. It's one of the most powerful antioxidants our body produces. It's growth hormone is the most powerful antioxidant our body produces. Next, we have it's neck and neck. We have melatonin and glutathione. And after that, we have catalase and we have superoxide dismutase. But your melatonin and your glutathione are about neck and neck as far as their power as antioxidants. And melatonin has a particularly beneficial effect on the nervous system in that it protects the nerves in the nervous system and the neurons from falling apart. It's an antioxidant to those particular cells and structures in our body. And if you're not sleeping, you're not getting that melatonin. Your body produces melatonin while you're sleeping. So if you're not sleeping, you're not producing the melatonin, you're not getting the beneficial protection from the melatonin. So yes, sleep deprivation will be a contributing factor to what's called neurodegeneration. Okay, so the degeneration of the nervous system, because that protecting chemical, that protecting hormone, melatonin, isn't there to protect things, so they are more prone to damage. What about sleep deprivation in young developing children or teenagers or young adults? Those are typically the years where we believe and feel that we're invincible. Nothing can hurt us, nothing can happen. We're fine, right? It takes. Here's an interesting fact. 90 days of getting less than 6 hours of sleep causes disruption in 700 different enzymatic systems in our body. Okay, causes those enzyme systems. The enzymes are they're the chemicals that cause the chemical reactions in our body for our body to function. Okay, there's 700 enzyme systems in our body that get affected by way of down regulation, meaning they don't work as well after only 90 days of sleep deprivation. Okay, most of those begin after only 30 days of sleep deprivation. Okay, so say you're working nights and you're going to school during the day and you're only sleeping 2-3 hours, 4 hours a day. And you know, how many people are out there doing that? And so to stay awake, you're drinking energy drinks and coffee and all these other things, these stimulants, which some of them do provide vitamins and minerals, although they're synthetic vitamins and minerals. But their energy drinks cause an increase in the utilization of nutrients in your metabolism. Okay, so in order to keep that energy going, they have to use nutrients that are in your system, which causes you to become nutrient deficient way faster. Okay, so you put in an accelerant into the system. Okay, it speeds up how fast you burn through the nutrients that are in your diet or that are stored in your body. As that happens, if you don't replace those nutrients, okay, if those nutrients aren't replaced, you end up nutrient deficient. If you are nutrient deficient and you're exposed to toxins, you are a toxin sponge. I can't say that enough, okay? That's universal. Anyone that is nutrient deficient, they're deficient in basic nutrition. There's 73 nutrients that you need on a daily basis. If you're not getting those and you're being exposed to toxins, which we are in our environment, you are a toxin sponge. Those nutrients act as gatekeepers, okay? They keep the toxins from coming in. And so if we don't have those nutrients, the toxins just come in, okay? And if we're using accelerants or stimulants in our diet in order to stay awake because we're not getting enough sleep, we're burning the candle at both ends. Problems will occur. It's not they might or might not, they will at some point. We have to eliminate accumulated waste in the body in order to reduce inflammation in the body. As long as there's waste that's accumulating in the body, you have two things happening. One, the waste itself will cause inflammation. Two, the waste is going to be very attractive to pathologic microorganisms. Okay, so all the bugs that cause infection like the waste that accumulates in our system. So if we want to reduce inflammation, we got to eliminate waste. Okay, and that's cleansing the colon, cleansing the liver and kidneys, cleansing the lymphatic system. Those types of things have to happen. And once we've done that, then we have to start working on heavy metal and chemical detoxification. Okay, there are things like selenium and iodine and magnesium that all work. They work really well at neutralizing different toxins in our body. Particularly, like magnesium helps to neutralize aluminum in our system. Zinc and selenium help to neutralize mercury in our system. Iodine helps to neutralize fluoride and also things like BPA in our system. And if we don't supply those nutrients while we're at the same time trying to eliminate the heavy metal toxicities and chemical toxicities, we go back to that problem. If our yard's full of dandelions and all we do is go out and dig up those dandelions and leave a bunch of holes in the yard, and we don't fill that back up with nice grass or grass seed and fertilizer of some sort, we end up with a yard that's just as ugly as it was with the dandelions. And all of those holes would be perfect places for new dandelion seeds to take root. Right? So, in order to, as we're pulling heavy metals out of the system, we need to be infusing the body with nutrients. We got to get those nutrients into the system. So we offset that load of toxicity with a influx of nutrition. So we have those nutrients so the body can heal and fix itself. To recap, we have diet, where we have one half of the diet is vegetable, a quarter of the diet is fruit, and a quarter of the diet is protein. We have cleansing, detoxification of the colon, the GI tract, the liver, the kidneys, and the lymphatic system. And then we have where we move on into detoxifying the body of chemicals and heavy metals and those types of things, while at the same time infusing the body with nutrients. We got to get the body, we got to fill in the holes, right? So those are the steps. Now there's other therapies. There's neurofeedback therapies. There's biofeedback therapies. There's cranial sacral therapy. Cranial sacral therapy in particular is a very, very good therapy for restoring proper blood flow in the head, in the cranium, in the skull, which is where your brain is, by the way. And then the neurofeedback therapies and biofeedback therapies are very good. They're electrical therapies that help to retrain the brain and can actually reroute neurons, and it's very, very good therapies, very helpful for Alzheimer's. Some folks have a real difficult time with heavy metal detoxing, and when we use things like EDTA or DMPS or DMSA, those are sometimes so aggressive that it just causes more inflammation for them, and they actually have a real hard time with it. The things that we use, the things that I have, are very powerful antioxidants, while at the same time they're very powerful heavy metal removers, and they neutralize pesticides and herbicides and things like that.
So when we got started in this field, nobody had used the ketogenic diet in Alzheimer's disease. The context for me was that this is not the first disease that this diet has been proposed for. It's nearly 100 years that the ketogenic diet has been used for epilepsy, to control epilepsy when the drugs don't work, which is a lot of the time. So there was quite an experience with this. It was kind of an orphan treatment. The drugs don't work, we'll try a second drug, try a third drug. Oh, well, we've heard of the ketogenic diet, let's try and implement it. And so I have worked with those parents, I've worked with those patients, I've worked with those doctors, and I knew that it was considered to be outside the box. But I also knew that there were some brilliant successes with epilepsy. So we said, well, let's learn about how this would work in Alzheimer's disease.
Alzheimer's terrifies a lot of people. You know, this, as one doctor said, you know, they come and say, I don't want that brain-eating disorder that I saw my granny go down with. And people, of course, know that labs are burning the midnight oil trying to come up with answers to this. What we've seen is some amazing studies. Vitamin D deficiency is very prevalent in this. Excess or high sugar diets would actually position Alzheimer's historically as being bang on target for 1906, which is when they named it after Dr. Alois Alzheimer, because that's coming about 20 to 25 years after sugar and refined flour is unleashed into our society for the very first time in unlimited quantities. Other studies, the vitamin B group, high potency vitamin B complex, was studied at Guildford and London and shows that you can methylate buildups of homocysteine, which when those levels get over 13 micromoles, people go into the fog. They started developing cognitive problems. And by introducing high levels of vitamin B12, we're seeing that that's methylating the homocysteine and bringing it back down under 8 micromoles. And literally, it's like flicking a switch. It's like pulling people out of the fog. So vitamin D, coconut oil has been well studied. Dr. Mary Newport has done a lot on this. There's a lot of very, very good, well-constructed, well-structured studies that are showing that if you get somebody going into early stage cognitive impairment, there's a huge amount you can do. And we should be doing it.
My husband, Steve, he was an accountant. He worked at home for my practice so that he could take care of our children at home. And when he was about 51 years old, he began having memory issues, making payroll mistakes, having trouble organizing his accounting, and then he began forgetting if he'd been to the bank and the post office, which was very odd. He was only 2 years older than me, and I didn't think I would forget that type of thing. And at first we attributed it to depression, but he kept getting worse. And in 2004, when he was only 54 years old, he was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And he had the early onset form of the disease, which happens in about 2% of people with Alzheimer's and people who are less than 65 years of age. I just happened upon this information about ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain on the internet. A press release about a medical food that was being studied. It wasn't going to be out for another year. It improved the memories of nearly half the people who took it with Alzheimer's disease. And I had to find out what it was. And I learned from their patent application that it was medium-chain triglyceride oil. And I was familiar with that because I'm a neonatologist. We used to add it to the feedings of our premature newborns, a little bit to each feeding, our tiniest ones, because they absorbed it very well and because it helped them grow faster. So I knew right away what MCT oil was. I think if I wasn't a neonatologist, I would not have, nothing further would have happened. I wouldn't have known that I could get it and what it might be able to do. But with Stephen, what happened was I knew that coconut oil was available over the counter, and I learned from the patent application that MCT oil is extracted from coconut oil, and coconut oil is about 60% medium-chain triglycerides. So he was scheduled for 2 screenings for 2 different clinical trials, 2 days in a row, and I learned this information the night before the first screening and didn't really have time to go out and do anything about it. So we had a day before and a day that he started coconut oil. It was very amazing. And the first screening, when we didn't have it available, he scored 2 points below the threshold that he needed to get into the clinical trial, and that was devastating. He was asked to draw a clock. He drew a few little random circles and a few numbers. I think it was 9, 10, 11, 12, just a very random, nothing structured like a clock, and I was told that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. So I thought, what do we have to lose? I'm going to pick up some coconut oil, and we stopped at a health food store on the way home. And when we got home, I looked on the internet for more information to remind myself what are the medium chain triglycerides. I found the fatty acid composition from a USDA website of coconut oil and learned that it was 60%. So I calculated how much coconut oil I would need to give him to equal 20 grams of medium chain triglycerides that they were using in the medical food. So the next day, that turned out to be a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. And the next morning, a few hours before he was scheduled for the screening, I put a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil in some oatmeal, and he ate that. And several hours later, he improved. We were in a different center than we were the previous day, but he remembered a different town that we were in. He remembered the day of the week. He remembered the season. He knew what floor we were on, and those were things that he could not remember the day before when he took the mini mental status test. And this time he scored 18, which was 2 points over the threshold to get into the clinical trial. So he was literally accepted into a clinical trial because of his response to simply taking coconut oil. And, at first, I wasn't 100% sure, did we just get very lucky or was it really the coconut oil? But we decided to keep it going. And so every morning in the beginning, he would get a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. And then I started cooking with it and got every recipe I could get my hands on, and eventually added MCT oil as well because it's more ketogenic. Certain medium chain fatty acids raise ketone levels higher. And I continued coconut oil because that's what he improved from. Initially, I thought, what if there's something in coconut oil that's not in MCT oil that has something to do with this effect? So we incorporated both into his diet, and we saw steady improvement over about a 9-month to 10-month period, where he went from the day before not even being able to draw a clock, and if we were gardening, for example, he couldn't remember if he was digging a hole or filling it in. He would get confused about the simplest things that he was doing. He had great difficulty finishing a sentence. And over a 9 to 10 month period, he improved so much. Physical symptoms went away, like tremors and a stiff gait. His memory began to improve. The animation came back in his face. People with Alzheimer's often have kind of they call it a dead look. That came back. His sense of humor came back. He had a visual disturbance where he could not read, and he described it. He couldn't describe it until after it went away with coconut oil. He said it was like the words were moving around on a page. The shaking stopped, and then he was able to read again. 9 to 10 months after we started this, he was able to remember what he had read earlier in the day and tell me about it. And one example of that is we were in a doctor's office. I was the one that had the appointment, and he sat in the waiting room. And there were Scientific American and other magazines on the table. And several hours after we left the doctor's office, he said, "You know, I was reading this Scientific American article about Albert Einstein, and he told me details about that, and it was just so profound to me that he had come so far that before he started using coconut oil, he couldn't remember if he was filling in a hole or digging the dirt out of it, and now he could remember what he had read, something that detailed several hours earlier." It was just really an amazing journey to see his recovery and reversal of a lot of his symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And one of the overwhelming things about it was now I have this information that nobody else knows. The medical food in the press release, they didn't say what it was or how it worked. And here, this is a little case study, you know, a study of one person who responded very quickly to taking medium chain triglycerides. In this case, it was coconut oil in the form of coconut oil. And, you know, this medical food wasn't going to be out for a while, and I thought, this is on the shelf. People need to know about this. They need to know about it now, and there are 5 million people in the United States and 30 million or so people worldwide, you know, that have this problem, and they don't have time. When you have Alzheimer's, you progressively get worse. Normally, there's no turning around. And, you know, I felt like people's brain cells were literally dying while I had this information. So it became really an obsession of mine to get the message out and to just let everybody know about it as quickly as possible. And
what would be your message to people out there that are suffering with Alzheimer's?
I would say that to look at nutrition. Look at nutrition as a guide to trying to get better, and very specifically to look at ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain, and looking at ways that you can increase ketones in the blood. Exercise can do that. Taking foods like coconut oil and medium chain triglycerides can do that. Reducing the carbohydrate in the diet can do that. So that there are things that can be done that could increase fuel to the brain, which is extraordinarily important in Alzheimer's disease. And for people who want to prevent it, if you have family history of it, you need to know that this process could be starting 20 or 30 years before you have symptoms. So reducing sugar in the diet, I think, is just extraordinarily important, and looking at ways to increase ketones, since they can provide alternative fuel for the brain.
Right. So the conventional medical approach to managing Alzheimer's is to give a monotherapy. It's to give a medication, and typically what's given is donepezil and or memantine. And these do not attack the cause of the problem. So you're essentially trying to trick nature, go around and say, okay, we can alter the system. They don't affect the large number of contributors. So we initially identified 36 different contributors, and we tell people, imagine you have a roof with 36 holes in it. You want to close all the holes, and of course for different people the holes are different sized. And your vitamin D, your estradiol, your NGF, your BDNF, these things all tell you something about your risk. So the conventional approach is to give a monotherapy like donepezil or memantine, and it's been relatively unsuccessful. You can get an improvement, but then you go right back to decline again. So as far as an alternative approach, and I think we talk about alternative medicine, but for so many of these complex chronic illnesses, whether you're talking about type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome or a number of the autoimmune diseases or congestive heart failure or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, instead of calling these alternative, we should perhaps call them effective, because they are the most effective things we have now for type 2 diabetes, the most effective things we have for autoimmune diseases, the most effective things we have for some of the gut health related diseases. So this alternative, or in this case, first effective approach for cognitive decline involves a very, very different approach. Instead of saying, we have a small data set, we know that you have Alzheimer's disease, but we don't know why you got it, and we're going to give you a monotherapy and you're not going to do well. We've changed everything. So first of all, we want to understand everything about what actually caused the disease. Therefore, we want a much, much larger data set, just as you would do in any sort of functional medicine evaluation. And frankly, the larger the better. We'd like to know all of the potential contributors to systemic inflammation and to local inflammation. And then we'd like to know, what are all the potential toxins you've been exposed to? These are all critical to understanding. From that, then we have an algorithm. What is actually causing your cognitive decline or your risk for cognitive decline? When you have a much larger data set, then you can look at that, and instead of saying, yeah, this is a mysterious illness, we don't know why you got it, this becomes a non-mysterious illness, and you can see the actual contributors to the cognitive decline. Then what we want to do is address each of these.
I think people give away their power instead of grasping a hold of it and really embracing it. They give their power to the doctors instead of relying on the fact that we were all born with the ability to heal. And we have healed ourselves so many times, hundreds if not millions of times, millions if not billions of times. We've healed ourselves because we were born with that ability. That's how we are made.